Begin with a so-called First Sino-Japanese War. It's actually the second, but that always is problematical, and we could be playful about how many Sino-Japanese wars there really were over Korea. But the first one was Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea in the 1590s, a double invasion in which thousands of forces, naval and armies, were forged to invade Korea. And Hideyoshi's goal was quite modest, to conquer China and then move on and conquer India. There was a tremendous military power emerging in Japan at this period of time. It eliminated the Jesuits and put them aside. It eliminated the Portuguese and made later on only the Dutch as players in the Japanese system. Now, this is an interesting battle between Ming navies and armed forces united with the Chosen dynasty to fight off the invasions. And in terms of naval power, it was state-of-the-art in the 1590s as much as naval power in the 1890s was state-of-the-art in the Sino-Japanese War of that time. This is 300 years before 1894-95, and the narrative that emerges from this one is very different from the narrative that emerges from the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. Chinese army at that point, and navy, were mainly a coastal army and navy, equipped with cannon and firearms, with Qi as a major general in that period of time, leading a major reform of cannon making in the late Ming that we know very well about. The Manchus later would mimic this and use cannon to defeat the Ming dynasty in pounding the cities of the north and south into rubble in this period of time. Ultimately, the Ming Navy and the Choson Navy together ruled the seas and prevented the Japanese from landing troops necessary to fight the land battles on Korea. The opposite was the case in 1894-95, when the Japanese could land forces and prevented the Chinese from landing their superior sources. Those reasons for failures in the 1590s, I suggest to you that these came up in the discussions in the 1890s when they realized we have to keep the Qing from landing forces in Korea to win this battle. And they successfully were able to do that with their sea power. Now, in this battle, Hideyoshi dies in the midst of the end of it, and the Japanese retreat. It is never declared a failure or a loss, but it is declared a retreat because the great leader Hideyoshi has died. But in fact, it's a loss on the ground and at sea, as the Chinese and Korean Navy has obliterated many of the Japanese ships, and at most of the land battles, the Ming cannon have also destroyed the defenses of Hideyoshi's forces. So this is a failure for Japan. Here, we begin to see a China that is dominant militarily, economically, and otherwise, and Japan, in many ways, with its new policies, is emerging as a nation of semi-seclusion. No one expected in the Kangxi period or the Qianlong period that the Japanese would defeat the Chinese at war and become the preeminent power of Asia. That was not on anyone's radar screen in that period of time. The scenery is the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War is perhaps less famous today than the Russo-Japanese War because it is a regional war, even though it had great international significance. The invasion of Japanese troops into the Korean Peninsula was in many ways intended to take Korea from the tributary system hold that China had on Korea. The Japanese weren't sure of the victory in the beginning, but very quickly, by the winter of 1895, it was clear that they would march through and take advantage of the collapse of Qing forces and also the failure of Qing forces to bring in enough troops on Korea to deal with the army of Japan sufficiently. Similarly, in the Russo-Japanese War, the predominant area of warfare will be in Korea and also beginning also in Manchuria. Port Arthur will play an important part in many of these issues. Many of us have forgotten that Port Arthur was in many ways the Gibraltar of the East in the 1890s. It was the greatest fortification in the world outside of Gibraltar. And taking it was a very, very important site for the Japanese. And as they did with Singapore, rather than attack Singapore head first, they came from behind. That is how they took Port Arthur. They came from the land, from the Korean side, and then marched into Port Arthur from the land side and didn't take it head on. It was that well fortified. Certainly other sea battles were waged at Weihaiwei and along the borders. But in these situations, the scenery was very, very reminiscent of warfare since. Korea is still on the map. The Sino-Japanese-American conflict over Korea remains in place on this same territory. And those of you who know your Chinese history know that Japan and China have gone to war over Korea many times. Arguably, the First Sino-Japanese War may have been in the medieval period when the Tang forces came in to help Silla, and then Silla tried very hard to get rid of these helpers so that they could form their own independent state. And then, of course, Hideyoshi's invasions in the 1590s, which could be the first or second war, depending on how you're counting, making 1894, 95, the second, third, or fourth war, depending on how you're counting. So I want to also put these things in larger perspective. We've forgotten the wars with Silla. We've forgotten in many ways Hideyoshi's war, a very well-forgotten war that the Japanese do not try to focus on as a failed war or a war without victory. It was simply a retreat, the death of Hideyoshi, and the continuation of Japan in their home islands. Now, I'd like to give you two films first to get a view of the so-called imagery. These are optical illusions as well, even though they're actual films. And in this particular framework, this is a clip from the Sino-Japanese War. You'll see Japanese battleships attacking Chinese ships at the Battle of the Yalu River. And they last about 10, 15 seconds each. Well, the Chinese ships are the ones, of course, that are taking the beating. These are the Japanese ships. Those are the Chinese ships. Chinese ship being blown up. I didn't see any Chinese junks there. What I saw were Chinese battleships losing to Japanese battleships, ironclad vessels all around in this particular battle. Now, 10 years later, the more famous war on the international scene, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, we also have a clip of the Japanese defeating the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait. And I want you to notice the difference in firepower, what has happened in 10 years since 1895 to 1904, of what the Japanese can throw at the Russian Navy in this period of time. Note the guns have proliferated, and the fast-firing guns in particular are available. We are on the eve of World War II here. These are the battleships and the guns, except for the aircraft carriers, that will be fighting in the Pacific among American fleets and Japanese fleets over control of the Pacific. Now, this is the Junyuan of the Beiyang fleet under Li Hongzhang. And again, I'm reiterating, this is ironclad. This is not a junk from the Ming Dynasty. This is not the Zhenghe fleet. This is a modern vessel, many of them produced in Fuzhou at the Fuzhou shipyard, and also at the Shanghai shipyard and other shipyards and arsenals throughout China. Many of the fleet is also purchased from Germany, from France, and England, who made available ships in this period of time to the new navies of Japan and China and other emerging countries. The French-built Matsushima was the imperial flagship of the Sino-Japanese Navy. It was the fastest, quickest, and fastest firing vessel available at that time. The Barrow shipyards in England, today they make nuclear submarines. Earlier they made battleships of this variety. And you can see the firepower of these battleships in the early 20th century, late 19th century, is quite considerable. Again, this is the Matsushima, a picture of it. This is the Dingyuan, the flagship vessel for the Li Hongzhang Navy, the Beiyang Navy, and one can see that this is purchased from Germany. It's a vessel purchased from Germany. In the woodblock prints, in this situation, the Chinese vessels became the black ships, and as we'll see shortly, the Japanese vessels became the white ships, the good guys. Some of you may remember that when Commodore Perry was visiting Japan in the 1850s, the Japanese described those ships as the black ships because of the steam power the exhaust that they released. In this depiction of the Chinese versus Japanese Navy in the Sino-Japanese War, white and black became very clear in the woodblock prints, even though in the films the darkness was not so clear. So in this context, the Chinese Navy is being sunk as black ships by victorious, the good guys, ships of the Japanese. The Chinese sailors here are in many ways left to their own. There's no effort to save them, and this became a major issue in the national world at that time. How does one treat prisoners of war? How does one deal with sailors who have lost their ships? Do the enemies have to be able to bring them up and preserve them as much as possible? What is humanitarian? What is going on in these situations? Begins in this period of time. And it's an interesting discourse that the Sino-Japanese War confronts, and later the Russo-Japanese War confronts in terms of global etiquette in warfare. Now, the Second War, if we want to call it the Second War, turns out when you look at it from the beginning point, was a very, very important battle in military history. It was the first great naval battle of employing fully ironclad, steam-powered vessels. The Franco-Prussian War had been a land-based war. Certainly there was the Bismarck and other ships for the First World War, but the first major war as a test case for ironclad, steam-powered vessels remarkably came in this battle between the Japanese and the Chinese. In fact, if one goes back and looks at the rankings of these navies, in this period of time, the Qing Navy had 65 ships and ranked 8th in the world in 1893-94. The Japanese had 32 ships. They ranked 11th in the world. This was how you weighed in terms of tonnage, kinds of guns and armaments that were available, and Mengye and other graduate students I worked with at UCLA would go through these materials and quantify what the perspective on these navies was before and after this particular defeat. The Japanese naval fleet of 32 warships, 23 torpedo boats, had about 14,000 sailors. The Chinese had many more ships, but they were divided into 4 navies. And the Northern Fleet and the Southern Fleet, based in Fuzhou, had not worked together during the Sino-French War of 1883-84, and now the Southern Fleet wasn't going to come to the rescue of the Beiyang Fleet in 1894-95. So in other words, the Japanese full well knew that they were going to be taking on only 1/4 of the Chinese Navy, and they made quite clear that they were not going to threaten foreign interests in Shanghai or anywhere in South China, that they were only interested in the Beiyang Fleet and only interested in Korea and the domains of the North. So in this context, at the Yalu River battle, each side had about 12 ships in the class. China had the advantage in armor and weight in a single salvo, measured by those who study war naval history, while the Japanese had a decided advantage in speed of ships and total amount of metal thrown in a sustained exchange of salvos. I don't want to bore you with that kind of information, but what had happened, of course, was no one knew what was going to work here in the war as it worked out. Was bigger and heavier bombs going to work, or was quicker, faster firing guns going to work? And in many ways, what came out of the war was quicker and faster firing were the way to go. And you could see that in the Russo-Japanese War, those quick firing guns and the maneuverability of the ships compared to the earlier cruisers and battleships were one of the lessons that were learned from this war. So in many ways, the war was a very, very important lesson to the British navies and other navies in terms of trying to deal with these particular issues. And we also know from this period of time that by losing the battle, China was obligated, according to the treaties at that time, to pay a huge indemnity. France had paid an indemnity to Germany, and later, of course, in the First World War, Germany would pay an indemnity to the Europeans, to the French and the English, and this would decimate their economies and in many ways make normalization of their societies and economies very, very difficult. In this period of time, Japanese industrialization and the building of the fleet that faced off against the Russians was in part made possible by the huge indemnity that was taken in from the Chinese Qing dynasty in 1894-95. Add to that later the Boxer Rebellion and Japan's portion in that, and a good deal of Japan's emerging as a major naval power. The financial resources for that comes from these indemnities paid by the Chinese to the Japanese, which is usually overlooked and underestimated. So in that context, this warfare from the 7th largest navy in the world, the Chinese, to the 11th largest navy in the world, the Japanese, had turned into a victory for the Japanese and a complete failure for the Chinese. So far I haven't used Confucianism, culture, values, the Mandarinate, the emperor's absolutism as a set of problems. I'm simply saying, based on the battlefield performances of these vessels, the quickness of the Japanese fleets, the faster firing guns, corruption on the Chinese side, very often the bigger, heavier guns were firing cement-filled bombs and not bombs that would explode. So when they went through the Japanese vessels, they didn't explode. So corruption based on the Shanghai arsenal, supply lines and others also mattered quite a bit. So from a purely warfare studies kind of framework, this war in many ways was not that predictable. Many Japanese were not sure that the Japanese would win, but in the end it became a very quick victory after the winter of 1895, and particularly the taking of Port Arthur from the land side, that in many ways this became a fiasco for China and a remarkable unexpected victory for the Japanese. And I think we need to remember that before the war no one predicted particularly that Japan would win. Even Japanese were not that sure about it, and in many cases people felt China, because of its scale, its size, the troops it could muster, would win. As it turned out, the Chinese could not get their troops to Korea to fight land battles on an equal level with the Japanese. In every major land battle in Korea, the Japanese outnumbered the Chinese on the battlefield, the Qing army on the battlefield. That was because they controlled the sea lanes and because Chinese could not land troops onto, or allies could not land allies onto the Korean peninsula. Again, I'm not talking about Confucianism, I'm not talking about language or kings or other arguments. I'm giving you certainly the kinds of logistics that were involved in this particular warfare. What I'm also suggesting is that China could have won this war had different circumstances been in place. Had the Japanese had to fear the Fuzhou Navy coming and uniting with the Northern Fleet, that would have doubled the tonnage and the power of the Chinese Navy in facing off the fleet from Yokosuka, from Japan. Would the Japanese have gone to war over Korea at that point? Unclear. But nonetheless, that was certainly a fear and something that people had to take into account. And why Japan won? One of the arguments is Japan was open to change. The rapidity of westernization was faster in Japan, a smaller country. Samurai warlike traditions, warrior traditions versus civilian ideals would have mattered. The economic arguments, a lack of corruption in Japan versus an endemic corruption in China. The science and technology argument, which I've given center of place here, the quicker firing guns, the Japan surprise attack, for example, at Yalu, the Japanese didn't declare war. In modern warfare, you're supposed to declare war. Well, the Japanese weren't the first to do that, and the issue came up at the 1883-84 war between France and China when France didn't declare war and just invaded the Fuzhou fleet and bombed them. And from that, the Japanese learned that one didn't have to abide by the great laws of the 10,000 states, that one could in many ways win effectively by defying those rules and laws. And so one of the advantages that the Japanese also had was attacking without premeditation. So you can see the perspectives of 1895 began to see a period of the end of China, the demise of China, the fall of China, and where should China go. And I would add to that, Chinese began to accept that. And here we begin to see an important transition for the failure narrative of China coming out of a triumph narrative for Japan. Revolutionaries, after all, need a failed past. Revolutionaries need a failed country to revolutionize. And so in many ways, the Japanese and other accounts were providing the beginning reformers and the beginning revolutionaries with a failed China that must be revolutionized. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument of whether the revolution was inevitable or not, absolutely essential or not, but you can see that the beginning of the argument is China had failed so miserably in the Ming and Qing, particularly in the late Qing, that we needed and must have a revolution. And Japan, in many ways, helped build those kinds of arguments and helped support reformers and revolutionaries by taking them in as giving them havens after 1898 and certainly in other periods as well. Of course, if one says that the revolution required these kinds of narratives, well, that begins to question the narratives themselves and makes you wonder whether the narratives had that kind of objective cosmological power that meant that the revolution was inevitable, or maybe it wasn't all that simple. And maybe we have been snookered by a revolution in the 20th century that took itself into its own framework and argued that things were inevitable.